Let me start by telling you something straight because I don't like clickbait and I'm not going to give it to you. You cannot return an RV. There's no 30-day window, no restocking fee, no walking back into that dealership and handing over the keys with a receipt like you're returning a toaster that didn't work right. Once you sign that paperwork and pull off the lot, that sale is final, same as it's always been. So when you hear folks saying millions of Americans are returning their new RVs this year, understand right up front, nobody's literally returning anything. What's actually happening is a whole lot worse than a simple return. And I think you deserve to understand exactly what's going on because it's touching more families than you'd guess. And there's a real lesson in it for anybody thinking about buying, or anybody already sitting in a rig that's got them worried. I want to be upfront with you about something else too. This video is a little different from what I usually bring you. Most days I'm showing you a $5 fix, or a trick your granddad might have used to solve a problem at the campsite. Today I'm talking about money, and about a trend I think every single one of you watching, whether you own a rig right now, are thinking about buying one, or are just curious what's going on in this industry you love, deserves to understand clearly, without the sensational headlines and without anybody trying to scare you into a decision. Here's what's really happening out there right now. Folks are handing their RVs back to the bank. They're having them hauled off on a repo truck. Or they're dragging them into a dealership, trading them in, and driving away with a whole new loan that's carrying the weight of the old one buried inside it. That's not a return. That's a family climbing out of a hole, or in some cases, digging themselves a deeper one without even realizing it. And by the end of this video, you're going to understand exactly how a rig that cost somebody $60,000 or $70,000 turns into a financial mess in under 3 years. How to spot the warning signs before you're the one dealing with it. And if you're already in it, how to start climbing out instead of digging further down. I want to pause here and explain something about RVs specifically, because this whole negative equity problem hits harder in this industry than it does with a regular car or truck. An RV depreciates faster than almost anything else you're likely to finance. Drive a new rig off the lot, and depending on the type, you can lose a chunk of its value in that very first year alone, sometimes steeper than what you'd see with a typical vehicle, and steeper still than what most first-time buyers ever expect going into the deal. Part of that's just the nature of the product. RVs sit outside, exposed to weather, exposed to wear on the road, and the used market's flooded with enough variety that a 1 or 2 year old unit competes directly against brand new inventory, sitting right next to it on the same lot, often at a price that makes the brand new one look like the better deal by comparison. Add in a manufacturer that rolls out a slightly refreshed floor plan or a new decor package every model year, and last year's rig starts looking dated to a buyer walking the lot, even if mechanically there's nothing wrong with it at all. There's another piece of this puzzle that most folks never think about, and it's happening on the dealer's side of the counter, not just the buyer's. Almost every RV sitting on a dealership lot doesn't actually belong to that dealer yet. It's financed through something called floor plan financing, where the dealer takes out a loan for every single unit that arrives, and that loan racks up interest every single day that rig sits unsold. During the boom years, that system worked out great for dealers, because units sold almost as fast as they arrived, and that borrowed money got paid back quick. But now that sales have slowed down and all those units bought during peak production are still sitting on lots, dealers are bleeding interest on inventory. They can't move fast enough. That pressure is exactly why you're seeing so many aggressive discounts and pushy financing offers right now. It's not generosity. It's dealers racing to get out from under their own debt before the bank starts asking uncomfortable questions about their credit line. And when a dealer's desperate to move inventory, guess who they're most eager to make a deal with? Somebody trading in an underwater rig and rolling that old debt into something new. Because that closes two problems for the dealer at once, their old inventory and your old loan, in a single stroke. Now let's lay the foundation for how that hole actually forms in the first place, because without this one idea, none of the rest of this makes sense. Every RV loan out there is really a race between two things. what the rig is actually worth, and what you still owe on it. The value side starts dropping the second you tow that rig off the lot, and it keeps dropping fast for the first few years, sometimes losing 15–20% of its value in that very first year alone. The debt side, on the other hand, comes down a whole lot slower than most folks expect, especially in the early years of a loan, because most of what you're paying every month in those first few years is interest, not principal. You're basically renting the money before you're actually paying down what you owe on the rig itself. So picture that value line dropping like a rock, and that debt line creeping down like it's got all the time in the world. For a good stretch of that loan, sometimes 3, 4, even 5 years, depending on how it's structured, what you owe is sitting higher than what the rig's actually worth. That gap has a name in the finance world: negative equity. Simple as that sounds, it's the root of just about everything we're going to talk about here together today. Now, this problem isn't new at all. Folks have dealt with negative equity on vehicles for as long as vehicles have been financed. What's different in 2026 is how deep that hole has gotten, and how many people are standing in it at the same time. And to understand that, you've got to go back to where this whole mess started, which is the RV boom of 2020 and 2021. You remember what that was like. The world shut down, international travel dried up, folks were stuck at home going stir crazy, and suddenly an RV looked like the answer to everything. Freedom, fresh air, a way to still take a family vacation without getting on a plane or checking into a hotel. Dealers couldn't keep units on the lot. Manufacturers were running their plants around the clock trying to keep up. And here's the part that matters most for where we're at today. A whole lot of folks bought into that boom who'd never owned an RV before in their life, and they bought at the absolute peak of the market, when prices were inflated by demand that nobody expected to last. Manufacturers and dealers looked at those numbers and figured the good times were just getting started. So they kept building, they kept ordering, they expanded their lots, hired more staff, took on more debt of their own to keep the pipeline full. But that demand wasn't built on anything solid. It was built on lockdowns and stimulus checks and boredom. And once the world opened back up, once folks could travel again, could go back to restaurants and concerts and everything else they'd been missing, that demand for RVs cooled off fast. Manufacturers kept building for a while anyway, because that's how these big production lines work. They don't turn on a dime. So you had new units still flooding in while the buyers who would have snapped them up were already moving on to other things. That's the setup. Now let's talk about what that setup did to the people who bought in during those peak years, because this is exactly where the real trouble starts showing up down the line. A family that financed an RV back in 2021 locked in a price that, looking back now, was inflated well above what that same rig is worth today on the used market. They also, in a lot of cases, locked in a longer loan term than folks used to take on, because RV prices had crept up high enough that a shorter loan meant a monthly payment. A whole lot of working families simply couldn't swing. Where a 15-year loan used to be considered long for an RV, now you're seeing loans stretch to 18, even 20 years in some cases, just to get that monthly number down to something that looks manageable on paper. Stretch a loan that long, and you're doing exactly what we talked about with that value line and that debt line. You're keeping yourself underwater for years and years longer than you would have been on a shorter note. Now add rising interest rates into that mix. Rates that were sitting near historic lows back when a lot of these loans were written have climbed a good deal since. And for anybody trying to refinance, trying to trade in, trying to do anything with that loan, besides just keep paying it exactly as written, that climb makes everything harder. Higher rates mean less buying power if you're trying to trade into something else. They mean tighter lending standards, which means banks asking for bigger down payments and better credit scores than they used to. Right at the moment, a lot of folks need flexibility the most. So here's where a family ends up, and I want you to really picture this, because it's not some rare, unlucky situation. It's happening across this country right now in numbers that ought to concern every single one of us who cares about this lifestyle. They bought at the peak. They financed long. Rates have gone up since. Their rig's worth a whole lot less than they owe. And life doesn't stop and wait for the market to sort itself out. A job gets shaky. Health costs come up out of nowhere, the way they always seem to for folks our age. Grandkids need help with something. And suddenly that RV payment, the one that felt manageable a couple years back, starts feeling like a weight nobody warned them about. When a family in that spot finally hits the wall, there's really 3 ways it plays out, and every single one of them gets talked about like it's some kind of return, when really it's just 3 different flavors of the exact same underlying problem dressed up in different clothes. The first is trading it in on something else. Sounds simple enough, except when you're underwater, that negative equity doesn't just disappear because you drove onto a different lot. A dealer takes your rig in on trade, gives you what it's actually worth, which is less than you owe. And that difference, that gap, gets rolled right into the loan on your next rig. So now you're driving home in a new RV that's already underwater before it's lost a single dollar of its own value, just from carrying your old debt along with it. And the only tool anybody's got to make that new, bigger loan feel affordable is stretching the term out even further. It's not a fresh start. It's the same hole, just repackaged with a new set of keys. The second is what folks call a voluntary surrender. This one actually feels almost honorable when you first hear about it. You call up the lender, you tell them you can't keep up anymore, and you hand that rig over before things get any worse. I understand the instinct completely, and in a lot of ways it's the responsible move compared to just going silent and hoping the problem sorts itself out. But I want to be straight with you about what actually happens next, because the bank doesn't forgive what you owe just because you handled it politely. That rig goes to a wholesale auction, and wholesale auctions don't pay retail. A unit that might have listed for $40,000 on a dealer's website could sell at auction for a good deal less than that, because the buyer at that auction needs room to fix it up and still make his own profit. Whatever's left over after that sale, after towing, after storage fees, after auction costs, gets applied to what you owed. And whatever's still outstanding after all, that becomes what's called a deficiency balance. That balance is still yours. It can follow you. It can hit your credit report as a repossession even though you handed the keys over yourself, and it can sit there dragging your credit down for years. The third way is the one nobody chooses on purpose, and that's the straight-up repossession. You fall behind, the calls start coming, and eventually a truck shows up and hauls that rig away. Sometimes right off your own property. Sometimes wherever it happens to be parked when the recovery company catches up to it. This one's ugly for obvious reasons, but I want you to understand it's becoming a lot more common than folks realize. Because when a family's underwater and stretched thin, sometimes there just isn't a graceful way out, and the bill collector shows up before anybody's had the chance to make a plan. Before I tell you about somebody who lived through all this, I want to give you a few warning signs to watch for in your own situation, because catching this early gives you a whole lot more options than waiting until you're already backed into a corner. If you find yourself only ever looking at the monthly payment when you think about your RV loan, rather than knowing roughly what you still owe versus what the rig's actually worth today, that's worth correcting right now, today, before you need that information in a hurry. If you've never once gotten an actual trade-in quote or a rough valuation on your rig since the day you bought it, get one, even if you've got no plans to sell, just so you know where you stand instead of finding out for the first time during a crisis. And if you're already feeling that squeeze, where the payment that used to feel comfortable is starting to feel tight, don't wait for it to become impossible before you start looking at your options. Lenders have more flexibility to work with you when you reach out early than they do once you're already 30 or 60 days behind. I want to tell you about a fella I heard from. Name of Gary. Watches this channel regular. Reached out to me after one of my other videos to share what he'd been going through. Gary and his wife bought a fifth wheel back in the spring of 2021, right at the peak of everything we've been talking about. Financed it over 18 years to keep the payment reasonable. Figured they'd be full-timing well into retirement, and the long loan just meant they'd keep the rig that much longer anyway. So what did the term really matter? They'd done their homework as best they knew how, compared a few models, didn't buy the flashiest thing on the lot, and felt like they were making a responsible decision at the time. 3 years later, Gary's wife had some health issues come up. Medical bills piled on, and that RV payment, which had felt just fine a couple years back, started feeling like it was choking them. They called the lender, tried to figure out options, and found out they owed almost $18,000 more than the rig was worth at trade. Gary told me it was one of the worst phone calls of his life. Sitting there doing the math on a legal pad at his kitchen table, and realizing there wasn't a clean way out of it, no matter which direction he looked at it from. He said his wife just sat across from him quiet for a long while after he read her the numbers, and neither of them really knew what to say. They ended up doing a voluntary surrender, ate the deficiency balance over the next couple years, paying it off in installments, right alongside their medical bills. And Gary said the hardest part wasn't even the money. It was feeling like the dream they'd worked their whole careers toward had turned into a burden instead of a blessing. He told me he still gets a little emotional talking about the empty spot in the driveway where that rig used to sit. That story's stuck with me because Gary and his wife didn't do anything reckless. They bought at a bad time, financed a little too long, and got hit with bad luck at the wrong moment. The same combination that could catch any one of us off guard given the wrong set of circumstances. That combination is exactly what's playing out in driveways and campgrounds all over this country right now, quietly, without anybody making headlines out of any one individual family's story. I think it's worth asking who actually benefits from all this, because none of what we've talked about is some kind of accident. A dealership doesn't make much money on the sale price of the rig itself. That margin's thin. The real money's made in the financing, the rate markup, the fees tacked onto the paperwork, and especially in that rollover cycle we talked about. A customer who pays off a reasonable loan in 6 or 7 years and then drives that same rig for another decade isn't making anybody in that finance office rich. But a customer who buys more rig than they really need, stretches the loan long, ends up underwater a few years in, and rolls that negative equity into another purchase, that customer becomes what some folks in the business quietly call an annuity. They never really leave. They just keep signing new paper every few years, carrying old debt forward every time. Nobody's twirling a mustache in some back room plotting this out. It's just how the numbers work out when the whole system's built around the monthly payment being the only number anybody's shown, instead of the total cost of what they're actually signing up for. So let me give you the old school way of looking at this, because I think it still holds up better than anything the finance office is going to tell you. 20% down if you can manage it. A loan term you can actually see the end of, not one that stretches out further than you can picture your own future. And the whole cost of that rig, payment, insurance, and upkeep together, staying well under what you can comfortably handle on your income. Not just barely squeezing by if everything goes right. If the rig you want doesn't fit inside those numbers, that's not the bank's way of telling you to stretch the loan further. That's the math telling you plain and simple. It's the wrong rig for where you're at right now. And there's no shame in buying smaller, buying used, or waiting another year or two until the numbers actually make sense. If you're already in a rig that's underwater right now, I want to leave you with something a little more hopeful than everything we've covered so far. The single best move, more often than not, is the most boring one there is. Keep the rig. Keep making the payments. That value line stops falling as hard after the first few years, and your principal payments start catching up faster the further along you get. The gap does close. given enough time, as long as you stay in the boat instead of jumping out of it in a panic. What you don't want to do, if you can possibly avoid it, is roll negative equity into another loan just to get into something different. That's not an exit. That's the same hole with a fresh coat of paint on it, and a longer road back out than the one you're already on. I want to hear from you on this one because I know Gary's story isn't the only one like it out there. If you or somebody you know has been through this, whether that's a trade-in that rolled old debt forward, a voluntary surrender, or worse, drop a comment down below and share what happened. Not to embarrass anybody, but because these stories are exactly what helped the next family avoid ending up in the same spot. I read every single one of these, and I promise you, sharing what you've been through helps somebody else out there more than you probably realize. And if you're currently shopping for your first RV or thinking about upgrading, I'd love to hear that too. Because knowing this information ahead of time puts you in a completely different position than the folks who learned it the hard way. If there's one thing I want you carrying away from this video, it's that an RV is still one of the best ways I know of to build a life full of good memories with the people you love. That hasn't changed, and it isn't going away, no matter what the market does in any given year. What's changed is how that purchase gets financed, and how easy it's become to end up in a hole without ever meaning to, simply by trusting the monthly payment number the finance office hands you, instead of doing the math yourself first. Buy smart, buy within your means, and keep that loan short enough that you can actually see daylight at the end of it. Do that, and you'll never have to worry about being one of the families we talked about today, and you'll get to enjoy this lifestyle the way it was always meant to be enjoyed, as a source of freedom instead of a source of worry. I'm Hank Dawson. Thank you kindly for listening to Roadside Wisdom, and I'll see you in the next one.